Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Chancellor has declared that there is light at the end of the tunnel, confirming forecasts that UK debt is expected to fall for a sustained period for the first time in 17 years. In his first spring statement, Philip Hammond described it as a turning point in the recovery from the financial crisis. But the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell said he was cut off from the real world.
It forecasts more jobs, rising real wages, declining inflation, a falling deficit and a shrinking debt. The economy grew by 1.7% in 2017, compared to 1.5% forecast at the budget. And the OBR have revised up their forecast for 2018 from 1.4% to 1.5%. Forecast growth is then unchanged at 1.3% in 2019 and 20, before picking up to 1.4% in 21 and 1.5% in 22.
His complacency today is astounding. We face, in every public service, a crisis on a scale we've never seen before. Hasn't he listened to the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, the carers, and even his own councillors? They're telling him they can't wait for the next budget. They're telling him to act now.
Well, our economic editor, Ed Conway, is in Westminster with more analysis. Ed, what can you tell us?
Thanks, Gamal. I mean, let's have a look, first of all, at the biggest number of all, growth. Just how fast the UK economy is growing. This is one of the things that's been focused on. Remember, this is not like a budget where you're getting any new policy. It's really just about a statement of how the UK economy is doing. How is it doing? Well, this shows you growth. So the rate at which national income is increasing each year, and the forecast that we had last time around, back in November, and you'll see they're relatively weak. Normally, you'd expect the UK economy to grow by about 2%, 2.5%. But remember, last time they cut those growth forecasts. This time around, they've upgraded them. So just look at these new red bars, a little bit higher in the first few years, so 1.7%, 1.5%, but then weaker in these final years. So weaker growth off into the future. And as well, the key thing to remember is only a year ago, we were expecting stronger growth than this. Let me put in what we're expecting, what was in the forecast just a year ago. You can see those bars higher every single year, about 2% at the start and relatively higher every single year. So weaker growth than we previously expected, but a bit of an upgrade. How does the UK compare internationally? Well, we got a sense of that from the OECD. The big international think tank produced their latest forecast on how they expect economies around the world to grow. And they said the UK was going to grow by about 1.3% this year, 2018. How does that compare with the rest of the OECD members? Let's add them in now. It's a slightly striking picture, isn't it? The UK at the bottom of the pack there, 1.3% growth. And all of these other economies, France, the US, Germany, Australia, Korea, India, all growing a lot faster than the UK. That's not something the Chancellor would have mentioned today, but it is something that's concerning economists. Nonetheless, stronger economic growth means you have to borrow a little bit less. So these bars show you the amount the UK government is having to borrow. And of course, when the economy is stronger, it means more taxes coming in. You don't have to borrow as much. And as a result, this is the forecast last time around. Just look at these bars. This is today's forecast, a little bit lower each year. Of course, lower is better in this case. It means less borrowing through to the end of the forecast horizon. But clearly that's good news, but it's going to take a long time to wear away that deficit. Remember, George Osborne wanted to remove the budget deficit by around this period here. This was the forecast he gave. Remember, as I said before, this is the amount of borrowing. Lower is better. Lower gets you towards that surplus where you're no longer having to borrow. Back in June 2010, he wanted to get it down very quickly indeed. But then along came the euro crisis, along came a lot of unexpected things. And each year, those forecasts were brought further off into the future, so that where we are now is this. You can see that red line there shows you the amount of borrowing we've had. It's a lot bigger and has gone on a lot longer than George Osborne originally anticipated. And here's where we are today. just look at how far the deficit is going off into the future. We'll still be borrowing a lot of money come 2022. And the Chancellor's message here is, as a result of this, we still need to keep trying to bear down on spending, to have a little bit more austerity for a few more years yet.
Ed, thank you.
The Chancellor gave an unexpectedly upbeat assessment of the UK economy today, saying there is light at the end of the tunnel. Delivering his spring statement, Philip Hammond said if the country's finances remain strong, he may even be able to increase public spending in the autumn. Here's our political editor, Robert Peston.
The Chancellor leaving number 11 this morning for what used to be the spring budget.
Is that a spring in your step?
And has been downgraded to a spring statement. Now, if there was something in the seasonal air, Philip Hammond had drunk it, because he sloughed off his reputation as a gloom monger.
If there are any Eeyores in the chamber, they're over there. I, meanwhile, am at my most positively Tigger-like today, as I contemplate a country which faces the future with unique strengths.
So what is that light at the end of the tunnel, which the Chancellor says he can see? Well, because tax revenues are higher than he expected, the government will borrow £4.7 billion less than was forecast in November. And economic growth in the current year has been revised up to 1.5% from 1.4%. But that's still low compared with our competitors and is set to fall to 1.3% in 2019 and 2020. The Chancellor insisted forecasts are there to be beaten, and under intense pressure from colleagues for lots more cash for hospitals, the armed forces, local government and schools, he promised some jam, though not today.
If, in the autumn, the public finances continue to reflect the improvements that today's report hints at, I would have capacity to enable further increases in public spending and investment in the years ahead.
But his opposite number couldn't smell the jam.
Hasn't he listened to the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, the carers, and even his own councillors? They're telling him they can't wait for the next budget.
So has the weather changed as much as the Chancellor thinks? No, says his own forecaster.
The medium-term outlook for the economy and the public finances looks broadly the same. But there seems little reason to change our view of growth prospects over the medium term.
Now, from the Treasury, the signs of spring are all around. But who knows whether a sharp frost may yet rub out the Chancellor's hopes that the long, long winter for government spending is at last coming to an end. Robert Peston, ITV News.
The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, gave an optimistic assessment of the UK economy today as he delivered his spring statement. Mr Hammond said a small increase to predicted growth and a drop in borrowing for this year meant that there was light at the end of the tunnel. And he hinted that if the economy remained strong, he could increase public spending in the autumn. Labour said the improved outlook meant Mr Hammond should act now to end austerity.
And if, in the autumn, the public finances continue to reflect the improvements, I would have capacity to enable further increases in public spending and investment in the years ahead.
Hasn't he listened to the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, the carers, and even his own councillors? They're telling him they can't wait for the next budget. They're telling him to act now.
Well, Labour's response to the Chancellor's statement was that austerity is still hitting the most vulnerable, even though the Chancellor insists spending on people with disabilities is increasing. But families of disabled young people across the UK say services are worse now than they were 3 years ago. Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, has this.
Right, so I'll adjust your headrest a bit, OK?
Christopher Myers wants to be as independent as possible.
Tell me when, Chris.
But he has cerebral palsy and relies heavily on his parents and myriad parts of the healthcare system. He communicates yes and no by moving his eyes and operates a voice synthesizer from the headset on his wheelchair. He's in no doubt. Services for disabled people are deteriorating.
Things have always been tough, but things are getting tougher. People changing all the time, never knowing who is meant to be helping you and waiting weeks for them to respond. Some people are brilliant so it can be done right. My dad has to make so many phone calls and send so many emails to get anything done.
Christopher says over the years, as more services have been outsourced, it's harder to get things done. Fighting for even basic help at times, he says, is exhausting.
I have had to see my GP because I have been so stressed by services and had medication. Things like waiting 7 weeks for my wheelchair brake to be repaired. It never used to be that long when it was our local NHS. Keeping my wheelchair working and safe is a really basic thing so that I can live my life. Being made to feel bad because I need help. I have no control over my life.
Christopher was one of hundreds of disabled people and their families who took part in the study, looking at the state of disability services across Europe. In the UK, around half of all families said services for disabled children and young people were of worse quality than 3 years ago. More than 70% said it was harder to access therapists, more than half that it was more difficult to access education support. And more than 70% of families and professionals said access to social care support had deteriorated in the last 3 years. The author of the report says the evidence suggests austerity in the UK has been a key factor.
We were surprised and very concerned to find that for most questions the responses from the UK were indeed the worst across all of Europe. It isn't all about money, but of course money and resources make a difference. What we need is for children and young people, and particularly disabled children and young people, to be prioritised at every level, to make sure that if policies are being made that they're included and that their needs are understood.
Christopher says in many ways he's lucky. He has good advocates like his father, Paul, to help him get the care he needs. The Department of Health said anyone who needs to access health care should not face any barriers, and that reforms to special educational needs support would be the biggest in a generation. But Christopher still worries about the future. He fears the fight for care will get harder.
Jackie Long reporting.
Well, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has delivered his spring statement today, insisting there's light at the end of the tunnel for the UK economy and hinted at possible increases in public spending sometime later this year. The Office for Budget Responsibility's growth forecast for this year has been increased, albeit rather modestly, by 0.1% to 1.4%. And government borrowing will be lower this year than expected. The OBR now forecasts it'll be £45.2 billion, which could give the Chancellor a potential £5 billion for extra spending if he chose to do that. But the OBR nonetheless downgraded its forecast for 2021 and 2022, and Labour accused the Chancellor of astounding complacency given the pressures on public services. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg has the details.
Is there anybody out there? Number 11 didn't want us to pay that much attention. No fuss, no frills.
Do you have good news today, Chancellor?
Only the Chancellor slipping off to work.
Statement, the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
But what was this? A cheery Philip Hammond rushing to his place?
If there are any Eeyores in the chamber, they're over there. I, meanwhile, am at my most positively Tigger-like today.
Not much has changed from the world outside. True, the economy will grow a little bit faster. The debt will start to fall. Just. The day-to-day deficit, remember that? It's gone. But compared to other countries, the economy is sluggish and slow. Only a hint of easing off months away.
If, in the autumn, the public finances continue to reflect the improvements that today's report hints at, then in accordance with our balanced approach, I would have capacity to enable further increases in public spending.
That might have delighted his side.
John McDonnell!
But Labour accused him of not being in the real world.
Hasn't he listened to the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, the carers, and even his own councillors? They're telling him they can't wait for the next budget. They're telling him to act now.
But is he listening?
This is the 8th year in a row when a Conservative Chancellor has said to the public that dealing with the accounts is more important than what they might feel they need.
Well, I hear what you're saying, Laura, but the facts speak for themselves. I've put £11 billion. This is just what I've done since I've been Chancellor. £11 billion additionally into public spending in 2018-19. And I've promised to put more into the National Health Service this year if we get a deal on pay.
Many of your colleagues now believe that the evidence is overwhelming for more money to go into the NHS in the longer term.
Well, the evidence is clearly there that our population is getting older, that technology is developing in a way that makes more and more interventions possible and indeed desirable in the health service, and that does represent a continuous upward pressure.
Is the Cabinet at the moment discussing how to find more money for the health service, as some of your colleagues have told me?
Well, this is my responsibility to look at these things, but of course we look at all these issues, and as we approach the budget in the autumn and then the spending review in 2019, of course we will look at all these pressures across the piece.
Not good enough for these opponents.
This is a Chancellor that's asleep at the wheel. He really had to show today he was prepared to take action. There was nothing in that statement that creates confidence.
He has dispelled some of the gloom about the economy by giving statistics about employment, growth, the output, debt, etc.
What the Chancellor should have done, I think, is to be much more open and honest with the public and say there is no more public money for public services, which is very badly needed, and therefore we're going to have an increase in taxation to pay for it.
Not admissions the government is ready to make. Hard choices that will linger long after today, along with the Brexit bill revealed to be hanging around till 2064. Spring has not yet really sprung. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So while the Chancellor Philip Hammond spoke of a turning point for the economy, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, was less confident about the UK's economic prospects. Let's talk about the verdict on today. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, is here with me. And how would you characterise that verdict?
Well, certainly, Hugh, the rhetoric very positive. I think the figures rather more mixed. Yes, there was slightly better news on the economy for this year, slightly better news on borrowing, which might give the Chancellor a bit more headroom on public spending. The Office for Budget Responsibility said that inflation would be coming down prices. That means that income squeeze that has affected so many people could be coming to an end. But there's one big challenge in these figures. 1.5% growth is the new normal for the UK. We used to have growth of 2 to 2.5%, and the OECD, as you said that that put us at the bottom of the G20 list of industrialised nations' growth, behind America, behind Germany, behind France. And for every 0.1% of growth that you lose, that's lower tax revenues, that's lower government income, and that's less room for manoeuvre for spending on health and for defence and for education, which is what Philip Hammond will want to do when it comes to the big event, the budget, in the autumn.
OK, Kamal, thanks very much again. Kamal Ahmed, our economics editor.
Well, in the end, international news completely overshadowed the first ever Chancellor's spring statement. On this day in years past, we would have had a full-on budget, but Philip Hammond has moved that to the autumn. So today we had a slimmed-down update on where we are. The Chancellor's central thought was that the economic news is marginally better, spring is in the air, but the long-term projections have not really changed, and so only if things continue to improve will there be extra money to spend. Nevertheless, the Chancellor was in upbeat form, eschewing his traditional role as the gloomy one in the Cabinet.
And if, in the autumn, the public finances continue to reflect the improvements that today's report hints at, then, in accordance with our balanced approach and using the flexibility provided by the fiscal rules, I would have capacity to enable further increases in public spending and investment in the years ahead, while continuing to drive value for money to ensure that not a single penny of precious taxpayers' money is wasted.
He even likened himself to Tigger, who, by the way, we know from the top of the programme is not a Disney character, isn't a Milne character, but we were showing you some Disney footage. Now, what did the Chancellor have to do? He had to offer a more optimistic outlook, with hope of more spending later, but not so optimistic that people could demand extra spending now. And here's a graph to show why. Now, this is the Office for Budget Responsibility graph on borrowing, the OBR, the official forecaster. This is going to go back over a decade, and this is what has happened over the decade. And you see borrowing, this is the OBR history, it goes up at the time of the financial crisis, and that's what the government's done to it, it's got it right back down, and that is a huge adjustment to it. So, Are we there yet, as every impatient child asks on a long car journey? Can we relax now? Well, this is what the OBR did think would happen to borrowing over the next 5 years. This is what they projected back in November, borrowing falling but still not disappearing. So that's the old forecast, and then we've got the new, more optimistic one today, and here it is. Hey presto, and not much has changed. Borrowing comes down, but it is not eliminated. Well, I'm joined by Nick Watt, who is back with me. Nick, what were your impressions of this spring statement then?
Well, against that backdrop that you were talking about, the dour spreadsheet Phil became Tiggerish Phil and indeed liberated Phil. Now, he did come under some pressure to give a much stronger indication of spending increases in the November budget, but he said, no, I do have my fiscal headroom, 15.4 billion, but November's quite a long way off. So let's just be cautious about that. And two other things he will do in November is he will use that headroom to keep taxes low and to keep paying down the deficit. But we also saw liberated Phil, and the Chancellor was able to make the arguments against Labour that he was not allowed to make in the general election, and he's essentially going to say the choice now is between vote Conservatives and you will get spending up and debt down, vote Labour and you will get spending up and debt up, to which Labour will no doubt say, if you stimulate an economy, you can expand an economy.
One eye-catching thing, not so much obvious from the speech, but from the documentation of the OBR about Brexit.
That's right, a very striking graph in the OBR book that we should be able to see there, saying that the UK will be paying its Brexit divorce bill right up until 2064. It's important to say that the OBR is mapping out the Treasury plan for that.
Taking a while to extract ourselves.
So that means that it's going to take 48 years after the referendum for the UK to finally settle its accounts. Now, the Treasury is very relaxed about this because they're essentially saying two key things, which you should be able to see from that graph. 75% of that is going to be paid off by 2022, which coincidentally will be the next general election. And the other thing they're saying is this was actually a UK idea to ensure that the UK doesn't make any payments earlier than had it been a member state of the European Union. And obviously the crucial thing is pensions, and also if the UK wanted to change the profile of those payments, they could negotiate.
We could renegotiate it. Nick, thanks. Well, Mel Stride is Financial Secretary to the Treasury, government spokesman for us, and Peter Dowd is the Shadow Chief Secretary and can speak for the Labour Party. Very good evening to you both. Mel Stride, I'm interested, are you sort of happy with the level of public services, the delivery of them, what we get and how much we're spending on at the moment?
Well, we always want to do more, and indeed we have done a great deal. So since the Chancellor has been
so you
in
must
post,
be happy then.
We've spent over £60 billion additionally on additional public expenditure, and we put in the last budget an extra £6.3 billion into the National Health Service. That's on top of our £10 billion.
I mean, you're quoting all these numbers,
but these
the
are
£60 billion is a dodgy one because that's
cumulative.
But are you happy with the level of public services at the moment?
Going forward, what the Chancellor has said...
Are you happy or are you not? Mel, is it yes or no answer?
It has to be seen in the context of taking a balanced and measured approach to the economy.
Are you happy or not?
Well, what I'm happy with is that the Chancellor's clear sense of direction here is that we recognise we need to keep bearing down on the deficit and on the debt, and the OBR says that we're successfully doing that. At the same time, we look to invest in public services and those kind of drivers.
So obviously you're unable to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
No,
you're unable to say you're happy with the level of public services at the moment, and yet your policy is to cut them by another 1% in 2019, another 1% on top of that in 2020, and another 1% in real terms per capita. The day-to-day spending on public services still has to be cut year after year after year.
What we're saying,
so
Evan,
you must be pretty unhappy because you can't say you're happy with them at the moment. And you're planning another 3 years of
what we have to look at is the whole picture. Right. And the whole picture is firstly being a responsible government that takes a sensible approach to bringing down the deficit, because if the debt
you could put up taxes and you could pay the more spending money on the debt.
Well, this comes on to my other points, if I could be allowed to make them. So the first thing is that we need to bear down on the deficit, because if we don't do that, we leave ourselves vulnerable to external economic shocks. The second thing is we want to invest in our public services. We've done a huge amount of that over the previous period.
You're going to be cutting them.
And thirdly, and this comes on perhaps to your tax point, we do indeed want to make sure that we do whatever we can to alleviate the financial pressures and hard-working
But you're just outlining...
So we have taken people out of tax,
you're just outlining
duty, and we will continue to look at those kind of measures.
Of incompatible objectives. You're not giving me a policy. You're saying a lot of things that we'd all love lower taxes, better public spending,
politics
and less borrowing. What's
politics
the point of
indeed budgets and the stewardship of any economy are, of course, about choices.
Peter Dowd, your choices are to spend more and to tax more, correct?
Well, to tax more in relation to the top 5%, yes.
So the IFS have said, you've got, on the one hand, you have the Conservative Party saying you can have all the welfare state you've ever had and pay no more tax, which isn't true. Paul Johnson of the IFS goes on to say, on the other side, you've got Labour saying we can levy more tax and it'll be someone else who pays because it'll come from companies and the rich, which also isn't true.
Well, it is true. I mean, we've had an assessment of this. I've spoken to you before about funding Britain's future that we set out in the manifesto. £48.6 billion worth of expenditure and £48.6 billion worth of...
Paul Johnson went on to say Labour's election manifesto had an awful lot of overestimates about what you can get from companies and the very rich, and it didn't fully balance out.
Well, yes, it did, because what we did in that document as well is set aside about 8% that we couldn't achieve for behavioural reasons. So we identified...
Do you take expert advice?
Of course we take expert advice. We don't.
And is there any expert better than any group of experts better than the Institute for Fiscal Studies on making these kinds of financial projections?
Well, of course they're entitled to their view, but we do take advice.
But their view is actually a pretty good view, isn't it? Because they've got huge models of the tax system.
Well, they may well have, but it's not the only view, and we can't base all our policies on what the IFS says or it doesn't say.
Should the public believe them, who have no skin in the game, they just want to give you what they think will happen, or believe you, who are trying to sell us that you can have better public services without having to pay for them?
Well, I tell you what we did ask of the government, and the government rejected it: access to the OBR. They refused to do that. So the independent,
the guy running the OBR used to run the IFS. I mean, you can go to the IFS; you'll get the same answer from the OBR. I suspect.
Well, maybe we would, but at least it's the opportunity to do it and to test that out.
Isn't the truth of this that both of you are just trying to deny the nation? You're trying to infantilise the nation and deny the nation of a perfectly sensible decision we have to make, that if we want better social care, want a better NHS, we probably have to spend another 10 or 15 billion pounds on public services. Borrowing is not too low, so we have to tax more, and we have to tax real people more to pay for extra public spending. Do you not? Do you have any agreement with that at all? Is that, am I just in cloud cuckoo land in suggesting that?
It's not a question of being in cloud cuckoo land. What we tried to do is set out our spending plans in our document.
So you would be against, for example, straightforward increases in spending on VAT, income tax, national insurance?
We've said that other than for the people we've identified, and at the end of the day, we wouldn't start from where we are now. That's the point. And the point that was made before, which is absolutely opposite, is the question of investment, and we're not getting the investment in the economy that we need.
And what about you, Mel Stride? I mean, do you ever think maybe we actually just need a bit more tax to pay for social care? That you're from Devon, aren't you? Your constituency's in Devon. What do your local Conservative councils say about funding in their backyard?
Well, we recognise that there are pressures out there, but as I said,
if the vulnerable and elderly of Devon are to be kept safe and adequately supported, it's essential that additional funding is secured. That's your local Conservative.
Look, there's no way of magicking up money and funding.
There is. You can put up taxes and say, look,
I know there are some.
But you're just denying that there's even a choice.
There are some who will say that is possible, but we know from history that it is not possible. And as the Chancellor pointed out today,
it's not possible to raise taxes for better public service.
What are you talking about? £350 billion.
What are you talking? You've just said it's not possible to raise taxes for better public services.
Because we take a balanced approach to the economy, which means that we have to get on top of the debt, but equally we want to take the pressure off hard-pressed households. So that doesn't mean overburdening them with additional taxes. The kind of tax and spend policy that the Labour Party will pursue will not leave people feeling better off. It'll make them feel a lot worse off, and in the long term, it will derail all the good hard work that we've done over the last few years.
Well, the government have got their own fantasy figures in their budget, and to make up fantasy figures for Labour is quite ridiculous. The bottom line, we've set out our spending plans. They're there for everybody to see.
And the IFS tell us they're not credible.
They're unambiguous. People have different opinions about this. But the bottom line is the nation is in a mess in terms of economic growth, productivity, the public realm's in decline, it's in atrophy, schools are going into... schools are having cuts to their budgets. It is in a complete mess. And people out there recognise that. People right out there who can't get social care recognise that. People, 75,000 children.
Well, even he recognises it, because he said he's not happy with the public services as they are.
No, I didn't say that, actually. But what I would say...
you are happy.
No, I didn't say that.
You didn't say you were happy with them.
I don't agree with Peter's characterisation of our country and our economy.
It's your cabinet, so that half your cabinet are arguing the same thing that Peter's arguing, that they need more money.
This is an economy that has a near record level of employment, has unemployment at about the lowest it's been in 45 years.
So why then is it not possible?
5 years.
Look, it's going very well, as you say.
There are many good things that are happening.
Why, if it's
but
going
that's not to say there's not a challenge.
If it's going so well, why do we not have social care that is adequately funded?
We will have a green paper on social care. We have already put £2 billion into social care, and the reason we've been able to do those things is that our stewardship of the economy has been a responsible one. And if you go for this tax and spend and spray the money around and turn the spending tax off, it ends up in disaster. It ends up back where we were in 2010, when we had a huge deficit.
Look, you keep on saying this tax and spend. You've gone from the sort of strong, stable, no, it doesn't, strong and stable economy to a magic money tree. You gave the DUP £1 billion, and that suddenly was found. The magic money tree analogy went. The bottom line is the country is in need of investment, and we're not getting it from the government. That's the reality of it.
We are, and that, gentlemen, I'm so sorry, I'm afraid we have to leave it. It was a good discussion, though. Thank you both very much indeed.